The Colorado Territory sprawled beneath a winter sky, the color of gunmetal, its vastness broken only by the serpentine gleam of Coal Creek, cutting through frozen grassland like a silver scar. In this unforgiving landscape, where survival depended on reading the smallest signs of danger, Nantan had learned to trust the whisper of wind through sage, the nervous flight of ravens, and the subtle wrongness that now prickled along his spine like ice water. Nantan was Jicarilla Apache, an agency scout who had ridden north from the New Mexico Territory, tasked by an Indian agent and a junior U.S. lieutenant to observe water claims and the new smelter traffic along the border country. Something was hunting him. The Apache scout crouched beside his cabin door, Spencer carbine steady in hands, scarred by 20 winters of frontier warfare. Steam rose from his breath as he studied the tracks pressed into mud that had frozen solid during the night. 3 horses shod with military precision, their riders circling his refuge like wolves testing for weakness. Each hoofprint told a story. The lead horse favored its left front leg, slightly suggesting a rider who pushed his mount harder than wise. The spacing between prints revealed controlled gaits, not the erratic patterns of drifters or casual travelers. These were professionals, and they had come with purpose. Inside his one-room shelter, the woman huddled near his stone hearth like a wounded deer seeking sanctuary. Her fine wool dress hung in tatters, revealing pale skin marked with bruises that spoke of violence and desperation. Dark hair, once carefully arranged in Eastern fashion, now clung to her shoulders in damp tangles that caught the firelight like strands of wet silk. Even unconscious, her face held traces of the intelligence that had first caught his attention and the same fierce determination he'd recognized in his sister's daughter, Little Bird. "Please," she whispered through lips blue with cold and terror, "let me rest here tonight." Nantan had found her 3 hours before dawn, collapsed beside Coal Creek, with ice crystals forming on her clothing, and the shallow breathing of someone close to death by exposure. Every instinct honed by 2 decades of warfare had screamed warnings as he'd knelt beside her still form. Whites who stumbled into Apache territory usually brought soldiers or bounty hunters in their wake. Apache scouts who sheltered fugitive whites rarely lived to discuss their charity with anyone. But as he'd lifted her limp form, feeling how her small frame weighed almost nothing against his chest, memories had assaulted him with unexpected force. Little Bird's fevered delirium, the winter she'd nearly died from the white man's spotted sickness. His sister Diani's desperate plea for him to find the army surgeon regardless of personal risk. The way gratitude could transform a face when someone chose mercy over prudence. Common sense still dictated he should have left this stranger to freeze beside the creek. Yet something deeper than tactical wisdom had compelled him to carry her to his cabin, to build up his fire and share his blankets despite the danger such kindness invited. Now, as hoofbeats thundered past his cabin in precise military formation, he understood that mercy might have doomed them both. "Who hunts you?" he asked quietly, settling the coarse wool blanket around her trembling shoulders with surprising gentleness. Her answer came in a whisper that made his warrior's blood turn cold. "Men who steal water and call it territorial law." The bone charm at his throat, a hawk carved by his father's hands from sacred elk antler, seemed to grow heavier as understanding dawned. This woman fought the same serpent coiled around Coal Creek, the shadowy force that had been systematically seizing Apache water sources and turning territorial officials into willing accomplices in broad daylight theft. The realization brought both relief and deeper concern. A common enemy might justify his risky compassion, but it also meant the hunters circling his cabin possessed resources and determination far beyond ordinary bounty seekers. Through gaps in his shutters, Nantan watched 3 riders emerge from the pre-dawn darkness like specters of judgment. The leader sat his horse with the fluid grace of a cavalry officer, his left hand encased in expensive black kid leather that failed to completely conceal some old injury. Even at distance, his pale eyes radiated the cold intelligence of a professional killer who had never failed to claim his prey. Something about the man's stillness, the way he scanned the terrain with predatory patience, sent familiar warnings through Nantan's consciousness. This hunter possessed skills that rivaled his own. Iron Hand. The name carried weight throughout the territory, whispered in saloons and trading posts, wherever silver spur mining and freight extended its influence. Some claimed he could track a man across solid rock, others that he possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate his quarry's movements. What everyone agreed upon was that Iron Hand's contracts were always fulfilled, his targets always found. Nantan had heard enough stories to respect this adversary's capabilities, though he'd never expected to face the man personally. And now he was hunting the woman who lay shivering by Nantan's fire. "They won't stop," she said, as if reading his thoughts. "I've seen their records, their true plans. They'll burn down every building in the territory before they let that evidence reach federal authorities." Nantan studied her face in the firelight, noting the intelligent set of her features and the way her eyes never stopped calculating, even in extremis. This was no frightened pioneer woman fleeing imagined persecution, and this was someone who had discovered something worth dying to protect. The realization both impressed and worried him. Brave people often died young in this country, especially when they opposed forces with unlimited resources and no scruples about eliminating inconvenient witnesses. "What is your name?" he asked. "Charlotte Fairfax. Until 4 days ago, I kept ledger books for silver spur mining in Coyote Springs." She pulled a water-stained leather portfolio from beneath her torn petticoat. "Until I discovered what they really intend for Coal Creek and every soul who depends on its water." The hunt begins. Dawn broke gray and bitter over the frozen landscape, revealing a world scoured clean by wind that cut through wool and leather like a cavalry saber. Nantan followed Charlotte's desperate trail backward through crusted snow, his moccasined feet finding purchase where her leather boots had slipped and stumbled during the night's flight. Reading the signs of her escape, he began to understand both her desperation and her remarkable determination. Blood droplets in the snow showed she'd been wounded before beginning her flight, yet the spacing of her footprints revealed a woman who'd maintained steady progress despite injury and exhaustion. Several times, she doubled back on her own trail, a clever attempt to confuse pursuit that spoke of intelligence under pressure. Near a lightning-split pine, she discarded a heavy wool cloak, choosing mobility over warmth with the cold calculation of someone who understood she was running for her life. The broken skiff lay half-submerged in Coal Creek's backwater, like the skeleton of some prehistoric beast, its planked hull deliberately stove in with an axe. Whoever had destroyed the small boat wanted to ensure their victim would have no means of escape downstream. No chance of reaching the territorial authorities in Denver with whatever evidence they carried. The violence of the destruction, splintered wood scattered across 20 yards of shoreline, suggested rage as well as calculation. Inside the wreckage, protected by oiled leather wrapping, Nantan found a bound ledger, several territorial documents bearing official seals, and a lady's tortoiseshell comb snapped cleanly in half. Mute testimony to violence, interrupted but not prevented. The comb's broken pieces lay among scattered hairpins and torn fabric, painting a vivid picture of struggle and narrow escape. When he returned to his cabin, Charlotte sat upright, despite obvious exhaustion, braiding her damp hair with strips torn from her ruined dress. In daylight, he could see she was perhaps 25, with the soft hands of someone unaccustomed to manual labor, but the steady gaze of someone who had learned to think quickly under pressure. Her movements, though careful and economical, showed the grace of someone well-educated in Eastern manners, now adapting to frontier necessities. "They call their enforcer Iron Hand," she said without preamble, recognizing the ledger in his weathered grip. He's been hunting me since I escaped from Coyote Springs. I know this man's work, Nantan replied carefully, his tactical mind already cataloging what he'd observed of their pursuer. Iron Hand moved like a cavalry officer, but possessed the patience of a plains hunter. His horse showed signs of hard travel, but remained sound evidence of someone who understood the importance of preserving resources during extended hunts. Most concerning the man, had positioned his companions to control escape routes, while he approached directly, displaying the kind of strategic thinking that made opponents predictable, while keeping his own options flexible. He serves those who steal Apache water, who turn farmers into refugees on their own land. Nantan continued. Something passed between them in that moment, understanding born of shared enemies and common cause. The mining company that threatened his people's ancient water sources was the same force that had driven this educated woman into the frozen wilderness, with death snapping at her heels. You helped me, Charlotte said quietly. Why? Nantan considered his answer while examining the documents she had risked everything to preserve. Column after column of figures told a story of systematic fraud that made his jaw clench with suppressed anger. But beyond the strategic implications, he found himself reluctant to examine too closely the protective instincts this woman had awakened. Something about her refusal to surrender her careful gratitude for his rough kindness, the fierce intelligence burning in her green eyes, had stirred feelings he'd thought buried with his family. Same enemy, he said finally. Make strangers into allies. But even as he spoke, Nantan knew there was more to his decision than strategic alliance. This woman represented something he'd almost forgotten, the possibility that courage and decency could survive in a world that seemed increasingly dominated by greed and violence. My sister Dayani tends wounds better than I can, he offered. Her lodge sits by Cottonwood safe water, one day's hard riding. Charlotte nodded, wincing as movement aggravated injuries he could only guess at. When she struggled to stand, Nantan caught her elbow with calloused hands that had learned gentleness late in life. Can you ride? He asked. I'll ride, she replied with quiet determination. Or I'll die trying. They left his cabin as the sun climbed toward its winter zenith, following deer trails worn smooth by countless generations of game-seeking shelter in the creek bottom. Nantan set a pace that balanced speed against Charlotte's obvious exhaustion, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon for signs of pursuit, while his mind worked through tactical possibilities. Iron Hand would find their trail within the hour, but the man's reputation hadn't been built on failures. But Nantan possessed advantages his pursuer might not expect: intimate knowledge of local terrain, the support of his sister's small community, and most importantly, the desperate motivation of someone protecting not just his own life, but something infinitely more precious. It came sooner than expected. The first shot kicked up snow 3 feet to Charlotte's left, the crack of the rifle echoing across the frozen grassland like thunder. Nantan's combat instincts engaged instantly, his mind cataloging distance, wind direction, and the slight upward angle that meant the shooter was positioned on higher ground. Professional work close enough to demonstrate capability, far enough to allow for negotiation, if desired. Ride hard, he commanded, spurring toward a stand of dead cottonwoods that offered the only cover within a mile. Behind them, Iron Hand and 2 companions crested a low ridge, their horses' breath steaming in the bitter air as they pursued with relentless patience. The black-gloved enforcer rode like a centaur, rifle steady, despite his mount's galloping pace, his pale eyes fixed on his quarry with predatory focus. Nantan noted how the man held his weapon ready, but not desperate, suggesting confidence in an inevitable outcome rather than fear of losing his prey. They reached the cottonwoods as a third shot splintered bark inches from Charlotte's head. Nantan rolled from his saddle, pulling her down beside him as their horses plunged deeper into the grove, seeking instinctive shelter. "He's good," Charlotte gasped, pressing her back against a tree trunk thick enough to stop rifle bullets. "Better than good," Nantan replied grimly, studying their pursuers through the leafless branches. Iron Hand had positioned his men to cut off escape routes, while he worked steadily closer, using terrain and timber, with the skill of someone who had fought Apache warriors on their own ground. Each movement was calculated, professional, inevitable. This was a man who understood that patience often proved more deadly than aggression. "We can't outrun them on tired horses," Charlotte said. "No, but we can make them pay for following us into thick cover." Nantan's Spencer carbine held 7 brass cartridges, enough to make the pursuit expensive if he chose his shots carefully. But killing Iron Hand's men would only bring more hunters, and eventually even an Apache scout's ammunition ran out. More concerning, he sensed this particular adversary wouldn't be deterred by casualties among his companions. Iron Hand possessed the cold professionalism of someone who viewed human life as an acceptable cost of doing business. "There's another way," he said quietly. "Old mining tunnel leads under the ridge. Dangerous, but better than dying here." Charlotte finished. They abandoned their horses and worked deeper into the cottonwood grove, moving with desperate quiet toward a barely visible opening in the ridge face. Behind them, Iron Hand's voice carried clearly through the winter air, calm and professional, as he directed his men into flanking positions. "She's in there somewhere. Take your time, make every shot count. They can't hide forever." The abandoned mine shaft reeked of stagnant water and long-dead hopes, its timber supports groaning ominously as Charlotte and Nantan felt their way through absolute darkness. The air hung thick with decades of accumulated moisture, carrying the mineral taste of deep earth and the sour smell of wood slowly returning to soil. Every breath seemed to echo in the confined space, while somewhere above them, boots crunched through frozen leaves as their hunters searched the grove with methodical thoroughness. "Hold to my belt," Nantan whispered. "Step where I step, trust the path." Charlotte's fingers found his leather belt gripping tight as they navigated fallen timber and treacherous footing by touch alone. The tunnel floor squelched beneath their feet with each step, cold water seeping through their boots, while invisible drops fell steadily from the ceiling above. The simple contact of her hand on his belt sent unexpected warmth through both of them, despite their desperate circumstances, her small fingers strong and sure, his presence solid and reassuring in the suffocating darkness. They moved like blind creatures through a world reduced to sound and touch. The scrape of rock against leather, the whisper of fabric against timber, supports the careful measure of breath in an atmosphere that seemed reluctantly shared. Behind them, growing fainter with each careful step, they could hear Iron Hand's men calling to each other as they searched the grove with increasing frustration. They emerged from the tunnel's far end as the sun touched the western hills, exhausted, but alive with enough head start to reach Diani's lodge before Iron Hand could pick up their trail. But Charlotte understood they had won only a temporary reprieve. "He'll find us again," she said quietly. "Yes," Nantan agreed, watching her face in the gathering dusk. Despite everything she'd endured, her expression remained determined rather than defeated. This woman possessed reserves of strength that continued to surprise him. "But next time we'll be ready." Sanctuary and revelation. Diani's lodge sat in a grove of ancient cottonwoods, where a natural spring fed Coal Creek's main channel with water so pure it seemed to sing over smooth stones. Smoke rose from the central fire, carrying the scent of burning cedar and medicinal herbs that spoke of healing traditions stretching back beyond white memory. The familiar smells of home sweet grass, cured buffalo hide, and the wild sage his sister gathered for her remedies brought Nantan a moment of peace he hadn't realized he'd been craving. Nantan's sister emerged as they approached a woman of 40 winters whose iron-gray hair was braided with trade beads that caught the firelight like scattered stars. She took in Charlotte's torn clothing and exhausted features with the practiced eye of someone who had tended many wounds, physical and otherwise. Her gaze lingered on the way her brother positioned himself protectively near the white woman, a subtle shift in stance that spoke volumes to someone who had known him since childhood. "Brother brings trouble to my door," she said in Apache, her words carrying gentle mockery mixed with genuine concern. "I bring one who fights the serpent coiled around our water." Nantan replied in English for Charlotte's benefit. Diani studied the white woman more carefully, noting the intelligent set of her features and the way she held herself despite obvious pain. Years of treating wounded warriors had taught her to recognize courage, and this woman possessed it in abundance, despite her soft Eastern upbringing. "She has courage," she observed, switching to English. "But courage without wisdom often leads to shallow graves." Inside the lodge, Charlotte sank gratefully onto buffalo robes, while Diani prepared willow bark tea and began cleaning her injuries with patient thoroughness. 8-year-old Little Bird peered curiously around the entrance flap, her dark eyes wide with fascination at their unusual guest. The child's open curiosity reminded Charlotte of herself at that age, before the world had taught her that different meant dangerous. "What did you discover that frightens them so badly?" Diani asked as she worked her skilled fingers, gentle but thorough, as she cleaned cuts and assessed bruises. Charlotte opened her water-stained ledger, revealing columns of figures and property descriptions written in precise script. "Water rights purchased through legitimate channels," she explained, pointing to official entries. "But here in the margins, you can see the truth. Rights acquired through forged documents, bribed officials, systematic intimidation of anyone who questioned their methods." Nantan leaned forward, studying the damning evidence by lamplight. The scope of the conspiracy was even worse than he'd imagined. These weren't opportunistic land grabbers, but organized criminals operating with territorial sanction. "How much territory do they claim?" "Every significant water source from here to the territorial border. Enough to control farming, ranching, mining throughout this entire region." Charlotte's voice dropped to a whisper. "Including specific funds allocated for what they call removals money, set aside for forcing people off their land through any means necessary." "Your name is here, sister," Nantan said grimly, pointing to an entry marked "Apache Problem Elimination Recommended." Diani's face hardened as she absorbed the implications. Silver Spur Mining viewed her family not as inconvenient obstacles, but as targets for destruction, their lives forfeit to corporate ambition. The realization brought both anger and a strange kind of relief. At least now she understood the true nature of the forces arrayed against them. "There's more," Charlotte continued. "I discovered that my own father's inheritance was stolen through forged documents. According to his will, I should own a section of Coal Creek bottomland, but company records show it belonging to Silver Spur Mining through a marriage contract I never signed." 8-year-old Little Bird crept closer, drawn by the adult's serious conversation, despite her limited understanding of the stakes involved. Charlotte smiled despite her exhaustion and beckoned the child closer, then noticed a torn cotton shirt among Nantan's possessions. "May I mend this?" she asked, indicating the damaged garment. Using Diani's bone needle and sinew thread, Charlotte began repairing the tear with small, precise stitches that spoke of careful training in domestic arts. Her movements were economical and sure the work of someone who understood frontier values of repair over replacement. As she worked, she found herself thinking about the strange turns her life had taken. 6 months ago, she'd been keeping books in a civilized office, worried about nothing more serious than balanced ledgers and proper penmanship. Now she sat in an Apache lodge mending clothes by firelight while planning resistance against corporate tyranny. The transformation should have terrified her. But instead she felt oddly liberated, as if she'd finally discovered what she was truly capable of becoming. As she worked, Nantan found himself watching her hands move across the rough fabric with unconscious grace. When she held the shirt up to judge the fit across his broad shoulders, she had to lean close enough that her breath warmed his neck and her fingers brushed his skin as she smoothed the mended seam. The innocent contact sent unexpected heat through him, a reminder that survival wasn't the only force drawing them together. "My father taught me that good tools deserve good care," she said quietly, not quite meeting his eyes. The simple words carried weight beyond their literal meaning. In a land where survival often depended on making do with limited resources, the care she showed for his few possessions spoke of values they shared, despite their vastly different backgrounds. As evening settled over the creek bottom, they shared corn soup while planning their next moves. The evidence Charlotte had gathered was damning, but incomplete. They needed access to Silver Spur Mining's complete records to prove the conspiracy reached into territorial government itself. "The stamp mill," Nantan said thoughtfully. "That's where they process claims and keep ownership documentation. If we could prove those claims are fraudulent." "The mill is heavily guarded," Dayani pointed out. During the day, her brother agreed. But at night, only a few watchmen maintained the machinery. It was a desperate plan, but desperation might be their only remaining advantage. As they prepared for sleep, Charlotte found herself studying Nantan in the firelight, noting the careful way he cleaned his rifle, the unconscious, protective gesture as he positioned himself between her and the lodge entrance. Everything about him spoke of competence and reliability qualities she'd learned to value above conventional attractions. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for helping me, for risking your family's safety." "Same enemy," he replied, but his dark eyes held warmth that went beyond strategic alliance. "Makes allies of strangers, family of allies." That night, as Charlotte slept on buffalo robes near the central fire, Nantan kept vigil under stars that wheeled overhead like scattered bone chips against velvet darkness. The hawk charm at his throat caught occasional firelight as he thought about the woman inside his sister's lodge. Her quiet courage, the way she had mended his shirt with such careful attention, and the growing connection he felt, despite every rational argument against it. These were dangerous thoughts for a man who had learned to trust sparingly. 20 years of frontier warfare had taught him that emotional attachments became vulnerabilities, that caring too deeply about someone only created opportunities for enemies to exploit. Yet something about Charlotte felt different from other whites he had known. She fought the same enemy, valued the same practical virtues, and asked for nothing except the chance to survive long enough to see justice done. When morning came, the chance would be tested in ways none of them could anticipate. The Network Awakens word spread through the territory's informal networks with the speed of prairie fire in dry grass. By noon, homesteaders throughout Coal Creek's watershed knew that Iron Hand was conducting a systematic hunt for someone who had stolen documents from Silver Spur Mining. The reward posted in Silver Spur and surrounding settlements offered $500 in US dollars, enough money to buy a small ranch or fund a family's move to California. More ominously, the notices described Charlotte Fairfax as a dangerous confidence woman and thief who had murdered a company clerk during her escape. The fabricated charges would make any decent citizen feel obligated to turn her in, while the substantial reward would motivate those whose scruples were more flexible. Virgil Pike discovered the poster nailed to his barn door when he went to milk his cow, the ink still wet from hurried printing. The weathered homesteader studied the description with growing unease. A woman matching Charlotte's appearance had been seen in the area, and Pike's neighbors would certainly notice if he failed to report suspicious activity. But as Pike stared at the wanted poster, his mind filled with conflicting obligations and fears. His wife Martha was expecting their third child in the spring, and $500 would secure their future in ways his marginal farming never could. The ethical choice seemed clear: report the fugitive and collect the reward that would transform his family's prospects. Yet Pike also remembered the surveyor's stake driven into his prize barley field, the one bearing Silver Spur Mining's registration number that threatened to divert Coal Creek away from his irrigation system. He had fought for 3 years to build his 160-acre holding into productive farmland, breaking his back on soil that rewarded honest labor with grudging prosperity. The internal struggle lasted several agonizing minutes as Pike weighed his family's immediate needs against the larger implications of what Charlotte Fairfax represented. If her accusations against Silver Spur Mining were true, and the surveyor's stakes suggested they were then turning her in, meant collaboration with the very forces threatening to destroy everything he'd built. Rather than report her presence, Pike rode immediately to warn Nanton, his conscience finally settled by the recognition that some compromises poisoned the soul even if they filled the pockets. Meanwhile, in Silver Spur's single-room schoolhouse, Miss Tabitha Morrison faced a different kind of pressure. The Territorial School Board had issued new guidelines requiring the exclusion of half-breed children from public education, part of a broader campaign to drive Native American families away from areas targeted for mining development. These policies come directly from the Territorial Authority. Board Chairman Horace Pettigrew declared, his voice carrying the smugness of someone who delivered unpleasant news while claiming moral necessity. We must maintain proper educational standards if we expect continued territorial support. Miss Tabitha, a spinster of 30, whose Eastern education had equipped her with both steel backbone and tactical intelligence, recognized the real source of these new requirements. Silver Spur Mining and Freight had purchased influence throughout the territorial government, and their corporate interests now shaped local policy through a combination of legitimate lobbying and outright corruption. "Little Bird reads better than half the children in this school," she replied with quiet defiance. "Education should be based on ability, not race." "The matter has been decided," Pettigrew said firmly. "These complications will be removed from our classrooms to preserve proper moral instruction." But Miss Tabitha had been quietly building her own network of resistance among townspeople who recognized that Silver Spur Mining's version of progress came at too high a price. Over the past months, she'd conducted careful conversations with the Methodist preacher about Christian duty to protect the innocent, with the blacksmith about the value of honest competition versus corporate monopoly, with several merchants whose businesses were being squeezed by company-owned competitors. Each conversation had been subtle, planted like seeds in fertile ground, allowing ideas to take root naturally, rather than forcing premature conclusions. The network she'd cultivated understood that their community was being systematically dismantled by forces beyond their control. Tonight, those quiet conversations would bear fruit in ways Pettigrew and his corporate masters never anticipated. When Pike arrived at Diane's lodge with news of the reward posters, he found a war council already in session. Dr. Ezra Franklin, the grizzled physician who served as the area's closest approximation to medical authority, had brought his own intelligence about Silver Spur Mining's activities. "They've been buying up debts throughout the territory." Franklin reported, his weathered face grim with accumulated knowledge of corporate predation. "Foreclosing on farms, forcing families to sell at below-market prices, then transferring the properties to company associates for mining development. It's worse than simple land grabbing," Charlotte added, showing him entries from her rescued ledger. "Look at these correspondence files. Letters to territorial legislators, payments to federal land commissioners, even requests for military intervention to pacify hostile elements interfering with legitimate business operations." The scope of the conspiracy silenced the small group gathered around Diane's fire. This was not merely local corruption, but a systematic effort to control territorial development through violence and political manipulation that reached into the highest levels of government. We need to get this evidence to federal authorities in Denver. Pike said his farmers' practicality cutting through the overwhelming nature of their discovery. Iron Hand controls the main roads, Nantan pointed out. And the telegraph lines run through Silver Spur. Any messages would be intercepted before reaching outside authorities. Then we need to gather more evidence while we plan a way to break through their surveillance, Dr. Franklin concluded. Make the proof so overwhelming that even corrupted officials can't ignore it. As they discussed strategies, Charlotte found herself studying Nantan in the lamplight, noting the way he unconsciously positioned himself where he could watch both the lodge entrance and her position, and the careful way he maintained his weapons while contributing to their planning. Every gesture spoke of protective instincts that went beyond mere alliance, creating a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the fire at her feet. When their council concluded and the others prepared to leave, Charlotte approached Diane with a request that surprised the Apache woman. "Teach me to use this properly," she said, indicating Nantan's spare revolver. "I can't keep depending on others to defend me." Diane studied the white woman's serious expression, recognizing something that reminded her of herself at a younger age, the moment when survival required abandoning conventional feminine helplessness in favor of practical competence. "Sister," she called to her brother in Apache, "your woman wishes to learn warrior skills." "She is not my woman," Nantan replied automatically, but his eyes lingered on Charlotte as she handled the heavy Colt with determined concentration. "Not yet," Diane said with gentle mockery. "But the heart chooses its own path, regardless of what the mind believes wise." That evening, as Charlotte practiced drawing and aiming the revolver under Nantan's patient instruction, both of them became acutely aware of how their hands touched when he corrected her grip, how their shoulders brushed when he demonstrated proper stance. The weapon felt alien in her hands, heavy, brutal, foreign to everything her Eastern upbringing had taught her about feminine propriety. Yet as she learned to control its weight and understand its mechanics, Charlotte felt something shifting inside her. This wasn't just learning to defend herself. It was accepting that the woman she'd been no longer served the woman she needed to become. "You learn quickly," he observed, as she managed to hit a pine cone at 20 paces. "I had good teachers," she replied, meeting his eyes with a directness that made his pulse quicken. "And good reasons to learn." Neither spoke the words that lay between them like uncut gems, but both understood that something profound was growing in the space created by danger and mutual respect, a connection that went far beyond temporary alliance. Blood at Echo Bridge. The attack on Echo Bridge came at dawn on a morning when frost turned the grassland silver and Coal Creek ran dark between ice-crusted banks. Nantan had chosen the narrow wooden span as the perfect place to intercept Silver Spur Mining's supply convoy wagons carrying equipment and armed guards to establish a permanent camp controlling the creek's upper reaches. What he had not anticipated was Iron Hand's tactical brilliance. The convoy appeared exactly on schedule, but led by 8 mounted guards instead of the usual 3. Worse, Iron Hand himself rode point his pale eyes, scanning the terrain ahead with predatory alertness that missed nothing. Not the carefully concealed positions where Dr. Franklin and Pike waited with loaded rifles, not the subtle wrongness of ravens avoiding their usual roosts, not the barely visible glint of sunlight on metal that marked Nantan's Spencer carbine. As Iron Hand studied the bridge approach, something indefinable nagged at his consciousness. The scene appeared normal, too normal for country where Apache scouts might choose to make a stand. His horse shifted nervously beneath him, ears pricked forward at sounds or scents beyond human perception. 20 years of survival in hostile territory had taught him to trust such instincts, even when logic suggested otherwise. A scent carried on the morning breeze, wood smoke mixed with something else. Something that stirred memories he'd spent years suppressing. Apache lodge fires burned differently than white man's hearths, carrying the distinctive sweetness of selected woods and the herbal complexity of traditional medicines. For a moment that lasted less than a heartbeat, Iron Hand saw himself as a child watching smoke rise from his family's fire, while learning to identify plants and animals from an older brother whose face had become a blur in his carefully guarded memories. The moment passed, buried beneath layers of professional conditioning, but it left him alert to possibilities his conscious mind refused to acknowledge. "It's a trap," Charlotte whispered from their hiding place among the cottonwoods. "He knows we're here." "Yes," Nantan agreed grimly, his tactical assessment confirming what she'd observed. Iron Hand's positioning was too perfect, his men too precisely deployed for coincidence. The enforcer had anticipated this ambush and prepared his own counter-strategy. "But we're committed now." He signaled the attack with a carefully aimed shot that brought down the lead guard's mount and the animal collapsing across the narrow bridge to block the convoy's advance. For precious seconds, the ambush proceeded as planned guards diving for cover, while teamsters fought to control panic-stricken horses, Pike and Franklin maintaining steady covering fire from concealed positions. Then Iron Hand demonstrated why Silver Spur Mining paid him so generously. Even as his men sought shelter, the black-gloved enforcer was already implementing a counter-ambush that turned their tactical advantage into a death trap. His rifle shots forced Nantan back from his position, while he directed his remaining riders with hand signals that spoke of military training and battlefield experience. Every movement was calculated to exploit weaknesses in the ambusher's positioning, while maintaining his own tactical flexibility. "They're getting behind us." Pike called out, his voice tight with growing alarm, as Iron Hand's riders spread out to flank their concealed enemies with professional precision. Nantan saw the trap closing with sickening clarity. Within minutes, the hunters would become the hunted caught in crossfire that would end with their bodies feeding crows beside Coal Creek's frozen banks. His mind raced through possibilities, discarding options as Iron Hand's tactical superiority became increasingly apparent. "Fall back to the cottonwoods," he shouted, but disaster struck before they could execute an orderly retreat. A ricocheting bullet caught Diane high in the chest as she shepherded Little Bird toward safety, the impact spinning her around like a child's toy. Bright arterial blood immediately began spreading across her deerskin shirt, and Charlotte rushed to her side despite the ongoing gunfire. "I can stop the bleeding," Charlotte said desperately, pressing both hands against the wound, while her medical knowledge warred with the evidence of her eyes. The bullet had found the great vessels near Diane's heart, and no amount of pressure could stem this particular tide. "Dr. Franklin." But Diane's glazing eyes told a different story. She gripped Nantan's wrist with failing strength, managing 3 words in Apache that carried the weight of generations. "Protect the water." The loss of his sister shattered something fundamental in Nantan's warrior composure. Grief and rage combined into a red fury that overwhelmed 2 decades of tactical discipline, rising from cover with his rifle raised to seek immediate vengeance, regardless of consequences. In that moment of devastating loss, nothing mattered except making Iron Hand pay for the blood he'd spilled. Diane had been more than family. She'd been the keeper of traditions and the healer of wounds, both physical and spiritual. The gentle strength that held their small community together. Her death felt like watching the last flame of his childhood, finally gutted by an implacable wind. Charlotte caught his arm with surprising strength, her grip anchoring him to sanity when fury threatened to carry him into suicidal gesture. "She wouldn't want you to die for nothing." she said fiercely. Honor her by finishing what we started. Her words and the iron grip of her small hand brought him back from the edge of futile vengeance. This was not the time for empty gestures. They still had evidence to protect and justice to serve. Diani's sacrifice would be meaningless if they threw their lives away in pointless retaliation. The retreat through broken country became a running battle, where every ridge offered potential concealment for enemy rifles. Dr. Franklin, blood seeping from a shoulder wound, struggled to maintain pace despite Pike's assistance. Little Bird, orphaned and traumatized, clung to Charlotte with desperate intensity that made movement difficult but reminded them all what they were fighting to protect. By the time they reached Echo Canyon's limestone sanctuary, they had lost more than Diani. One horse had been shot, their ammunition was running low, and Iron Hand controlled every route back to civilization. Worse, their carefully gathered evidence remained incomplete. They needed Silver Spur Mining's complete financial records to prove the conspiracy reached into territorial government itself. The stamp mill, Charlotte said as they huddled around a small fire deep in the canyon's protective embrace. It's our only chance to get the documentation we need. That's suicide, Pike objected bluntly. The whole town will be crawling with Iron Hand's men. Maybe. Nantan replied, his voice hollow with grief, but steady with renewed purpose. The loss of Diani had carved away something essential, leaving him with clarity born of having nothing left to lose. But Diani died protecting this water. I won't let her sacrifice be meaningless. As they planned their desperate assault on Silver Spur's industrial heart, Charlotte found herself studying Nantan's profile in the firelight. The loss of his sister had carved new lines of pain around his eyes, but something else had changed as well. A harder resolve that spoke of bridges burned and commitments made beyond the possibility of retreat. I'm going with you, she said quietly. Too dangerous. Those are my records in that safe. Charlotte interrupted. I know the combination, the layout, which documents are most important. You need me. Their eyes met across the small fire, and both understood that this was no longer about tactical necessity. They had become something more than allies, partners bound by shared loss and mutual trust, facing together whatever consequences their choices might bring. That night, as Little Bird slept between them, and canyon walls echoed with distant coyote calls, neither Charlotte nor Nantan spoke of the growing connection that pulled at them, despite every rational argument against it. Tomorrow would bring violence and quite possibly death, but tonight they had this moment of quiet intimacy in a world gone mad with greed and violence. When Nantan began carving a small piece of wood with his hunting knife, Charlotte watched his skilled hands shape the soft pine into recognizable form, a tiny hawk wing spread in eternal flight. For Little Bird, he said simply. So she remembers her mother's courage. Charlotte's throat tightened with emotion she couldn't name. In that simple gesture, she saw the man beneath the warrior facade, someone who understood that memory was sacred, that small acts of love mattered even in the face of overwhelming loss. She'll treasure it, Charlotte said softly. As I treasure this, Nantan replied, touching the older hawk charm at his throat. My father carved it before soldiers came, before everything changed. It was the most personal thing he had ever shared with her, and Charlotte felt privileged to witness this glimpse of the boy he had been before the world taught him that trust was a luxury few could afford. Tell me about him, she whispered. Strong man, wise. He said every hawk must choose its own sky, but family is the wind that lifts us highest. Nantan's voice grew soft with remembrance. He died protecting our winter camp. My little brother was taken that same day 11 years old, small for his age, always following me like a shadow. What was his name? Maka. It means earth. He loved growing things, tending plants, even when other boys mocked him for woman's work. Pain flickered across Nantan's weathered features. I never saw him again. Never knew if he lived or died among the white soldiers who took him. Charlotte reached out without conscious thought, her fingers covering his scarred hand where it rested on the carved hawk. The simple contact sent warmth through both of them, a moment of human connection that transcended the boundaries of race and circumstance. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "Sorry for your loss, sorry for all the losses." "Loss makes us stronger," Nantan replied, turning his hand palm up to capture her fingers. "Or it breaks us. Choice belongs to each person." "Which did it make you?" He studied her face in the firelight, noting the way shadows played across her features and the steady courage that had carried her through trials that would have broken many men. "Ask me tomorrow night," he said, "if we live to see it." Were storm and steel. The storm that struck Silver Spur came like biblical retribution, turning the sky into a battlefield of lightning and thunder that shook buildings and sent residents hurrying for shelter. Rain lashed the settlement with fury that seemed directed by divine wrath, while wind howled between structures with enough force to tear loose anything not properly secured. For Charlotte and Nantan, the tempest provided perfect cover for their approach to the stamp mill. They moved through the deluge like spirits of vengeance, using the storm's overwhelming noise to mask their movements as they worked toward the massive building that dominated the town's eastern end. The Echo Canyon stamp mill operated continuously, its crushing machinery powered by elaborate water wheels that channeled Coal Creek's flow through a complex system of sluices and grinding apparatus. Even in the storm, the rhythmic pounding continued mechanical thunder, mixing with nature's symphony in hellish harmony. Steam rose from the building's many chimneys, creating ghostly shapes in the driving rain that seemed to writhe with malevolent purpose. Iron Hand had posted guards around the mill's perimeter, but the storm had driven most of them to seek shelter in the nearby bunkhouse. Only 2 sentries remained at their posts, huddled under the building's eaves, where oil lamps cast flickering pools of yellow light that barely penetrated the driving rain. "There," Charlotte whispered, pointing through the downpour to a loading dock on the mill's north side. "That door leads to the administrative offices." They had studied the building's layout during their planning session with Miss Tabitha, who had provided detailed intelligence gathered from sympathetic townspeople. The stamp mill's business offices occupied the entire second floor, directly above the main processing area, where the company's most sensitive records were secured in a fireproof safe. Moving carefully along the swollen creek bank, they reached the loading dock without detection. The door was secured with a heavy padlock, but Nantan's hunting knife made quick work of the wooden hasp and the storm's noise covering the sound of splintering wood. Inside, the mechanical din was overwhelming. The stamp mill's crushing apparatus created a constant symphony of grinding, pounding, and sluicing that made normal conversation impossible, except by shouting directly into someone's ear. The air hung thick with dust from pulverized ore, creating a choking atmosphere that burned their lungs and limited visibility to mere yards. Heat from the boilers turned the interior into a hellish environment where sweat mixed instantly with grime, while the rhythmic pounding seemed designed to drive men mad through sheer repetition. But the deafening hammer-steady racket also meant their movements would go completely unheard by any guards in the building. They climbed narrow wooden stairs to the administrative level, where kerosene lamps provided dim illumination for the nerve center of Silver Spur Mining's territorial operations. Filing cabinets lined the walls like regimented soldiers, while territorial maps covered with red ink markings showed the scope of the company's ambitions. The contrast between the chaotic violence below and the ordered bureaucracy above struck Charlotte as grimly appropriate evil, often hid behind ledgers and legal documents, rather than revealing itself through obvious brutality. Charlotte went directly to the fireproof safe, her fingers working the combination with practiced precision, despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. 17 left, 43 right, 11 left. She murmured, muscle memory guiding her through numbers she'd memorized during months of maintaining Silver Spur's financial records. The safe opened with a solid click, revealing stacks of documents, bags of gold dust, and several leather-bound ledgers that contained Silver Spur Mining's most carefully guarded secrets. Charlotte began sorting through the most incriminating evidence, her trained eye quickly identifying the materials that would prove systematic fraud and territorial corruption. "This is everything," she said, pulling out correspondence with federal officials' bribery records and the duplicate books that showed the true scope of the company's illegal activities. Enough evidence to bring down the entire conspiracy. But as she worked, Nantan heard something that made his warrior instincts scream danger, the sound of boots on wooden stairs barely audible above the mill's crushing symphony, but unmistakably approaching their position. His Apache-trained hearing had detected what most men would have missed entirely, the careful, measured tread of someone moving with professional stealth. "Someone's coming," he warned, grabbing his Spencer carbine. They quickly gathered the most damaging documents, but before they could escape through the window, they had planned to use the office door burst open with explosive force. Iron Hand stood silhouetted in the doorway, his pale eyes reflecting the lamplight like chips of winter ice. "Going somewhere?" he asked with cold amusement. "Mr. Voss specifically requested that I ensure you remained as his guests until morning." Behind Iron Hand, 2 armed men blocked any retreat through the doorway. The black-gloved enforcer moved into the room with predatory grace, his rifle held with casual competence that spoke of absolute confidence in the outcome. "You've led me quite a chase," Iron Hand continued conversationally. "I must admit, I expected to conclude this hunt much sooner. Your resourcefulness has been educational. Brotherhood and recognition." The confrontation quickly shifted to the mill's main floor, where massive grinding stones and crushing hammers created a maze of mechanical hazards. Steam from the boilers, mixed with dust from ore processing, creating an atmosphere thick enough to limit visibility to mere yards, while the deafening hammer-steady mechanical roar made communication nearly impossible. The environment assaulted every sense, the overwhelming noise that seemed to penetrate bone and brain, the acrid smell of heated metal and pulverized stone, the thick air that caught in their throats and made breathing an effort. Sparks flew from grinding mechanisms, while the great water wheels turned with inexorable force, creating patterns of light and shadow that transformed the mill interior into something from a fever dream. Iron Hand stalked them through this industrial hellscape with patient expertise, using the machinery's noise and steam to mask his own movements while forcing them steadily toward a section of the mill where catwalks provided the only escape route 30 feet above the crushing floor. "There's nowhere left to run," Iron Hand called out above the mechanical thunder. "This building has 2 exits, and my associates control both of them." Charlotte and Nantan reached the service ladder and began climbing toward the elevated walkway system, bullets sparking off metal machinery below them, as Iron Hand's men maintained steady pressure. The narrow catwalks offered limited maneuverability, but also forced their pursuers to follow the same restricted paths. When they reached the main catwalk, Iron Hand appeared on a parallel walkway, having used a different ladder to cut off their escape route. The 2 walkways were separated by a gap of 8 feet, close enough to jump with sufficient momentum, but far enough to mean death if the attempt failed. "This is where your adventure concludes," Iron Hand said, raising his rifle with deliberate precision. That was the moment when Nantan saw something that stopped his heart like a physical blow. As Iron Hand shifted position on the narrow catwalk, Firelight caught a carved bone charm that had fallen from beneath his shirt. To swing on its leather cord, a hawk carved from elk antler and decorated with Apache beadwork in patterns Nantan recognized because he had created them with his own hands 15 years earlier. The charm was unmistakable. The specific curve of the hawk's wings, the pattern of beadwork around the edges, even a small chip in the antler where young Maka had dropped it during one of their hunting lessons. Nantan remembered every detail because he'd spent hours carving it for his little brother's coming-of-age ceremony, a ceremony that had never taken place, because soldiers had taken the boy before his 12th winter. Maka. He whispered the name torn from his throat like a prayer to ghosts. Iron Hand froze at the sound of his birth name spoken in Apache, the language of a childhood he had spent years trying to forget. For a moment, the professional killer's mask slipped to reveal something wounded and recognizably human beneath the scarred surface. The name hit him like a physical blow, stirring memories he'd buried beneath layers of violence and self-imposed exile from everything he'd once been. That name died with everything else, he said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. I carved that charm for you. Nantan continued his rifle lowering despite their deadly circumstances. Taught you to hunt prairie dogs while you wore it. You were 11 when the soldiers took you small for your age, always following me like a shadow. Memories flooded Iron Hand's consciousness like water through a broken dam. The patient hands that had guided his small fingers in learning to track, to read signs, to understand the language of wind and weather. Summer mornings spent learning the names of plants, the habits of animals, the stories that connected their people to the land that sustained them. An older brother who had never shown impatience with endless questions, who had treated a small boy's dreams and fears with serious respect. The recognition was mutual and devastating. Iron Hand Maka was Nantan's lost brother, stolen as a child, and raised by the very forces that had destroyed their family. The years had changed him beyond physical recognition, but the bone charm confirmed what Nantan's heart had begun to suspect. You chose your side, Maka said with bitter accusation, his voice carrying 15 years of suppressed pain and abandonment. You work for the agency. Now help them put our people on reservations like cattle. I scout for the agency to keep peace. Nantan replied carefully, understanding how his choices must appear to someone who had suffered so much. To prevent more children from being taken from their families. Like I was taken. The question hung between them, heavy with 15 years of separation and conflicting loyalties. Charlotte watched this exchange with growing understanding of the personal dimension that explained Iron Hand's relentless pursuit. This was about family betrayal and the impossible choices frontier life forced upon those caught between worlds. In Maka's scarred features, she could see traces of the boy he had been corrupted by years of abuse and forced loyalty to those who had destroyed everything he'd once loved. The tragedy of it brought tears to her eyes, even as she recognized the danger of this moment of recognition. It doesn't have to end in killing, she said quietly. There's still time to choose differently. Maka's bitter laugh held no humor. Choose Voss owns me completely. If I don't eliminate both of you tonight, he'll have me killed before sunrise. Then come with us, Nantan said urgently. Help us expose their crimes, bring them to justice. For a moment that stretched like eternity, genuine emotion flickered across Maka's scarred features. The bone charm swayed hypnotically as he wrestled with a decision that would determine all their fates. Charlotte could see the war between old loyalties and new allegiances playing out in his expression, the desperate hunger for family connection, warring with years of conditioning and the practical realities of his position. The moment was shattered by Sheriff Blackjack Crow's arrival, with additional armed men. Crow burst onto the mill floor with murder in his eyes, his voice cutting through the mechanical noise like a cavalry saber. "Enough family reunion," he shouted. "Mr. Voss wants this matter concluded permanently." But instead of raising his rifle to shoot, Nantan Maka turned the weapon on Sheriff Crow with fluid precision. "Put down your gun, Sheriff," he said quietly. "This ends now." The betrayal stunned Crow into momentary paralysis. He had counted absolutely on Iron Hand's loyalty, never imagining that blood ties could override years of conditioning and financial dependence. "You're making a fatal mistake," Crow snarled. "Voss will hunt you down like a rabid dog." Additional figures began entering the mill townspeople, led by Miss Tabitha Morrison, Dr. Franklin Pike, and others, who had finally found courage to resist Silver Spur Mining's intimidation. The schoolteacher carried a shotgun with grim determination, while the others were armed with whatever weapons they could find. In the chaos that followed, with visibility reduced by steam from a burst pipe and everyone seeking cover, Sheriff Crow made his final desperate gamble. He fired blindly at Charlotte, hoping to eliminate the primary witness to territorial corruption. Virgil Pike threw himself between Charlotte and the sheriff's revolver, taking the bullet in his shoulder while continuing to shield her with his body. Crow tried to fire again, but the damaged steam system sent a massive blast of superheated vapor into his face. Blinded and screaming, he stumbled backward into the path of the crushing stamps. The mill machinery made quick work of what remained of Blackjack Crow. In the sudden silence that followed, the steam loss had finally forced the stamps to stop. Miss Tabitha took charge with schoolteacher efficiency. Dr. Franklin attend to Mr. Pike's wound. Everyone else secure those weapons and ensure no one attempts anything foolish. Maka slowly lowered his rifle, the bone charm visible against his shirt, like a talisman of choices that could never be undone. He looked at Nantan across the catwalk gap, something approaching peace visible in his scarred features. "I can't undo 15 years," he said quietly. "You just did," Nantan replied. It was not forgiveness. Too much blood had been spilled for that. But it was acknowledgement that family connections could still influence choices when everything else fell away. Justice and new beginnings. The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving Silver Spur washed clean under skies that promised fair weather. In the stamp mill's administrative office, Miss Tabitha organized an impromptu hearing, while Dr. Franklin read aloud from the documents Charlotte had recovered. The evidence was overwhelming. Water rights stolen through forged surveys, bribes paid to territorial officials, systematic intimidation of anyone who opposed Silver Spur Mining's expansion. When the final tallies were read, even Gideon Voss's supporters among the townspeople understood the scope of the conspiracy they had unknowingly supported. "All evidence will be forwarded to federal authorities," Miss Tabitha announced with schoolteacher authority, "along with formal charges against everyone involved in defrauding the territorial government." Charlotte's personal victory was confirmed when Dr. Franklin produced documentation proving her legitimate inheritance of Coal Creek bottomland. The fraudulent marriage contracts were exposed, her father's true will validated, and her ownership of prime agricultural property officially restored. "What will you do with the land?" Dr. Franklin asked. Charlotte looked around the room at faces of people who had risked everything for justice. Pike sat bandaged, but determined, his wife Martha beside him, radiating quiet pride. Miss Tabitha held little Bird on her lap, the orphaned child finding comfort with someone who understood the value of education and hope. Even Maka stood among them, no longer Iron Hand, but not yet fully returned to his birth name, seeking a place in a world he'd helped to defend. The land should serve the community's needs, Charlotte decided. "I'll work with all of you to determine the best use." It was a decision that surprised no one who had come to know her during their struggle against corporate tyranny. 3 weeks later, Nantan knelt beside the foundation of his sister's reconstructed lodge, carefully placing Diani's woven sash in a parfleche bag that contained her few remaining possessions. The new building rose on the same spot where she had raised Little Bird with love and fierce independence. But it would serve a different purpose now, a place where the community could gather, where children could learn traditional skills alongside reading and arithmetic, where healing could take place in both the old ways and the new. Charlotte appeared on the path from town, carrying supplies and wearing the practical clothing she had adopted since abandoning her former life. In her satchel were territorial documents confirming her inheritance and legal status as an independent property owner. Dr. Franklin confirmed that my father's will has been fully validated, she announced. The court has restored my inheritance through proper legal channels. Nantan paused in his work, studying her face for clues about her intentions. Legal victory meant Charlotte could claim her property and establish herself as one of the territory's few independent women landowners. She could build a house hire worker's life respectably according to the conventions of her upbringing. "What will you do?" he asked carefully. "I've been keeping books for Pike and other farmers," she said. "There's sufficient work to support myself if I choose to stay in this area." The conditional phrase carried weight beyond its simple words. Choosing to stay meant accepting social disapproval, potential isolation, and the challenges of building an unconventional life in demanding country. "It won't be easy," Nantan warned. "People will question your choices. Some will question yours as well," Charlotte replied. "But that hasn't prevented you from making a life here." She was right. As an Apache scout working between two worlds, Nantan had learned to navigate suspicion and create his own definition of belonging. His relationship with the territorial authorities would be forever complicated by Maka's defection and the role they'd played in exposing corruption. But the evidence they'd gathered had also proven his value as someone who could bridge the gap between cultures. "I brought supplies for the construction." Charlotte continued producing tools and provisions from her satchel. Among them was a small wooden box containing her mother's domestic implements, symbols of permanent settlement and domestic partnership. "I thought I might help with the rebuilding," she said simply. The offer was both practical and symbolic. By contributing to reconstructing Diani's lodge, Charlotte was declaring her intention to become part of the community that had formed around Coal Creek's watershed. More than that, she was offering to share her life with him, to build something together from the ashes of what they'd lost. Nantan looked at her standing among the construction materials, her green eyes steady with determination, and something deeper he was finally ready to acknowledge. The woman who had stumbled into his cabin as a desperate fugitive had become someone he couldn't imagine living without. Not just because of the dangers they'd faced together, but because of the quiet courage she'd shown, the way she'd cared for Little Bird, and the gentle strength that had held him back from suicidal vengeance when grief threatened to consume his judgment. "I could use the help," he said quietly. They worked together through the afternoon, fitting logs and laying stones for a foundation built to last. As evening approached, Charlotte prepared a meal over their fire, while Nantan secured his tools for the night. The domestic scene felt natural despite its unconventional nature. Two people who had found their rhythm through shared labor and common purpose. "People will say we're not properly married," Charlotte observed, stirring corn soup with the practical efficiency she'd developed during weeks of frontier life. "People say many things." Nantan replied, his hands steady, as he arranged his tools with the care of someone who had learned their value. "Most matters less than they believe." As darkness settled over the creek bottom, Charlotte had brought bedding that made her intentions clear. This was not a temporary visit, but a statement of permanent choice. She had decided not just to stay in the territory, but to stay with him regardless of social consequences. "Let me rest here tonight," she said, echoing words from their first desperate encounter. But this time, the request carried entirely different meaning. Charlotte was choosing to make her home here with him, building a life that would be unconventional by any standards but their own. Nantan lifted the blanket that had belonged to his sister, draping it around Charlotte's shoulders as a pledge rather than mere protection. The bone hawk charm that had belonged to Mahka hung from the lodge's main support post, turning slowly in the evening breeze. His brother had left it behind when he departed to face whatever justice awaited someone trying to escape his past. But not before carving a companion piece, a small earth symbol that now lay beside Little Bird's sleeping furs. A reminder that growth was possible even after the deepest losses. Neither Charlotte nor Nantan spoke conventional words of love or made elaborate promises about an uncertain future. But as Charlotte settled beside their fire and Nantan took his place next to her, both understood they had chosen each other with full knowledge of the challenges ahead. The bone charm caught firelight and cast dancing shadows on newly built walls, a reminder that even in harsh circumstances, connections could survive and grow in unexpected directions. Tomorrow would bring more construction decisions about land use and ongoing challenges from a society that questioned unconventional partnerships. But tonight, they had shelter food and the quiet satisfaction of people who had fought for justice and won the right to choose their own futures. Rain began falling softly on their log roof, a gentle sound that spoke of renewal rather than the violent storms that had marked their early trials. Charlotte's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of peaceful sleep, while Nantan maintained quiet watch over their small fire. His mind finally at peace with choices that had once seemed impossible. Outside, the night sounds of Coal Creek returned, owl calls, beaver splashes, distant coyote songs claiming territory under star-filled skies. Inside their lodge, two people who had found each other during desperate circumstances began building a life together based on mutual respect, shared values, and love earned through survival rather than declared through words. The hawk charm continued its slow rotation in the night breeze, a guardian spirit blessing their unlikely partnership as they began writing the next chapter of their story in a land where determination and courage mattered more than conventional expectations. In the morning, Little Bird would wake to find herself part of a new kind of family, one built not from blood alone, but from choice commitment, and the understanding that love could grow in the most unlikely soil, when tended by hands willing to do the necessary work. And in the distance, barely visible through the morning mist, Mahka rode toward an uncertain future, carrying nothing but the clothes on his back and the knowledge that redemption was possible for those brave enough to seek it, even when the cost of seeking it meant leaving behind everything they had built from the ruins of their past.